Which outfit eats their supper first and gets the best campsite? From the days of the 1800s all across the prairie lands to the racetracks of the modern day, from Calgary to Cheyenne. Well, the Old West has sure come alive with the running of the wagon race. Chuckwagon evolution, from hotcakes to high stakes.
Take 32 highly trained thoroughbred horses, 4 canvas-top chuck wagons, and 20 cowboys. Add a tricky figure-8 turn inside a postage stamp infield, mix in a good portion of teamwork, and hurl the whole kit and caboodle out onto and around a 5/8 mile racetrack, and you have a recipe for the most spectacular horse race on earth.
Cowboys still try to outdo each other like the way they've always done. But instead of over 15 miles, today it's half of one. Around an oval racetrack where big dollars are their prize. This modern sport is a race through hell where the history still survives. From the days of the 1800s all across the prairie lands to the racetracks of the modern day, from Calgary to Cheyenne. Well, the Old West has sure come alive with the running of the wagon race. Chuckwagon evolution.
No one has worked with more wagon horses and watched more races than Chuckwagon matriarch Iris Glass. She knows what it takes to make a wagon man.
The first thing, you have to love a horse, and you have to know a horse. Be a good horseman. That is the first thing you have to be. And then you got to have lots of guts, if that's the word to say, and because it is a really rough sport, really. I guess it was late in '39 or something. He had a real bad accident. He upset his wagon and broke 16 bones in his body. My dad, so he quit then, and my brother took over, Jack, and he drove till 1945, I think it was. And then I married Ronnie, and on he drove for 46 years. Then Tommy started, and he's drove for 28. Now I got Jason, he's on his 3rd one, so into my 4th generation. For 70 years we've been going.
The Glass-Lauder connection to the Chuckwagon goes back even further, back to the early ranching era, and to Iris's grandfather, John Doc Lauder, who followed the range Chuckwagon as a foreman of the huge Cochrane Ranch. Doc, Tom, and Jack Lauder. Ronnie, Tom, and Jason Glass. That makes 5 generations of wagon men and their horses that have circled western racetracks or rumbled across the great western range. The first chuck wagons were adapted from surgeons' wagons used during the American Civil War. Texas drovers adapted the sturdy, wide-gauged wagon for use on trail drives. Emptied of bandages, surgical instruments, and medicine, the upright cupboard at the back was filled instead with cooking utensils, tin cups and plates, and the wagon's bed with enough staples to support a dozen men for months on the trail. The provisions included, of course, plenty of coffee beans for the grinder. There were thousands of gallons of coffee ground, brewed, and sipped from 1865 to 1884, when drovers trailed over 6 million head of longhorns up from Texas along the fabled Sedalia and Chisholm trails to markets in Kansas, or further north up the Western Trail to fatten on the rich, hard grasses of Wyoming and Montana. A capable trail boss didn't push his cattle. He normally let the herd graze and drift along at a leisurely pace of 10 to 15 miles a day. The cat-hammed longhorns were supposed to gain weight on their way up north.
And then you'd usually pick up and have an early breakfast and move till about 10 o'clock, and then you'd settle down and let the cattle rest and water, and usually move towards water and then rest and fill up during the noon hour. Took about 4 hours during the day to fill them up, and then when it cooled off, we'd move on again.
Riders spent most of the day in the saddle, as well as doing a 2-hour shift each night watching the herd. A 2,000-mile drive meant that men, horses, and longhorns could be on the trail for 4 to 5 months at a stretch. The cook was such a highly valued member of the crew, he earned a better wage than a top cowhand. After 16 to 18 hours in the saddle in wind, sun, or rain, day after day after day, the men developed wolfish appetites. There was no dieting, no calorie cutting, no cholesterol counts. Just to maintain already lean bodies, the men had to devour 3 big meals a day.
The meals were just put together. It was mostly just your normal meal, your meat and potatoes and bread.
But the Chuckwagon was more than just a place to eat and drink. A jacked-up hind wheel and a long rope made a perfect windlass to help pull bogged animals from flood-silted riverbeds. After a storm, men draped their damp shafts and slickers over the wagon pole to dry. And each night the cook angled the pole towards the North Star, so the trail crew had a compass point on clouded or misty mornings. In the 1870s, the Chuckwagon led cattle from the United States up onto the western Canadian rangelands.
Hotcakes to high stakes.
The Chuckwagon became an integral part of the big Canadian roundups every year. In late spring, the cattle were gathered and the new calves for each ranch were branded. In the fall, men, horses, and wagons were sent out to gather the grass-fat steers for market. These general roundups were well-organized affairs, with large ranches supplying complete wagons and crews, while smaller outfits sent 1 or 2 riders as reps. There were no fences to separate the different herds, just one vast open range. The 1885 Canadian Spring Roundup involved close to 100 men, 500 horses, and over 20 wagons. The riders gathered 50,000 head of cattle off a range the size of Ireland. Pioneer rancher Fred Ings, a rep for his OH brand, riding with the Bar U wagon, described the daily routine.
When we were gathered together, the range boss would give us his orders for the day. He would allot portions of the country to different men who would work that park thoroughly, bringing all the cattle he found back to a common center near the wagon. They were called circle rides, and usually 2 were made a day. After the second gather was accomplished, the men would prepare the fires in the ground to work the latest bunch of cattle. As the Bar U cattle were the most numerous, they were cut out first from each day's drive, branded, and turned loose. And then another and another brand would be worked out until all the calves in that bunch had been gone over. As the country was covered, the wagons and the cattle moved gradually west, sometimes every day to a new site, but always with a thought to wood and water.
There was enough demand for chuck wagons across North America that Studebaker designed a roundup model to sell through its catalog.
They were built short so they could maneuver and get around. It was pretty well weighted down. We had to have a 4-horse team on it.
They had bedrolls wrapped in a canvas sheet about 12 feet long and 6 feet wide, and the blankets were inside, and when they moved the wagons, they folded the beds up and rolled them up and tied them with straps or a bed rope and threw them in the bed wagon.
When setting up a new campsite, the bed wagon was parked so that a large rope corral could be anchored to the wagon's hind wheel. A special wrap on the wheel and hub made it easy to tighten the single strand of rope that circled and contained over 100 horses.
The herders would run them into this corral, and they'd rope them out. They'd get up before dark, and the man that was roping the horses, he'd know the horse by the ears. That's about all you could see.
Each rider needed 5 or 6 horses in his own personal string. The younger, less experienced mounts were used for the morning circle rides. A horse with plenty of cow sense was chosen to do the cut, and a rope-savvy horse helped lasso calves to brand. Because spring roundups occurred during flood season, each man also had a favorite deep water horse, and no one wanted his mount to stumble and spook a herd of resting cattle, so each rider also had a sure-footed, reliable mount with which to share the lonely night shift. A young man's fancy might stray to romance, but a good-looking horse was never far from his mind either. In Log of a Cowboy, veteran drover Andy Adams stated, "On the trail, an affection springs up between a man and his mount which is almost human. Every privation which he endures, his horse endures with him." If the days were long for riders and their mounts, they were even longer for the chuckwagon cook. The pressure of early mornings and late nights was too much for a few of them. Their nicknames tell it all. Cooks like Dirty Dick, Old Poison Finley, or another fellow to avoid, known simply as Death on the Trail. But most were capable and respected men, and around the campfires of a big roundup, the exploits of a top-notch cook were as much a topic of conversation as a fine roper or a great cutting horse. Open-range cowboys all seemed to have a sweet tooth. They craved raisin pies and rice pudding variations like Spotted Dog and Son of a Gun in a Sack. Sourdough recipes were popular too, as well as being a necessity in country where yeast was hard to come by. On frosty spring or fall nights, a cautious cook might even take his sourdough crock to bed with him to keep the precious mix from freezing. In Montana today, there are still batches of sourdough mix that can trace their lineage directly back to the 19th century roundup camps. When the men were not out on the roundup, they ate in the cookhouse, but often still slept outside with the wagon, away from the bedbugs.
Hotcakes to high stays.
By the turn of the century, railroad lines, irrigation ditches, and barbed wire fences were cutting the open range into smaller and smaller chunks. The fall of 1906 was especially hot and dry. Grass fires burned off sections of winter pasture and torched haystacks. The snow came early that winter, and it stayed, and temperatures dropped to record lows. Cattle, horses, and men suffered. Those ranchers who still had hay doled out what little they had, but it wasn't enough. Across western North America, open-range ranches lost over 50% of their stock. Riding past the rotting corpses made the following spring's roundup a bitter affair. That gather of 1907 was the last general roundup in Canada. Young Westerners wanting to follow the Chuckwagon would now have to prove themselves in the race. Calgary Stampede creator Guy Wiedeck was dedicated to preserving a sense of the real West. It was in his home state of New York where Wiedeck demonstrated his first Chuckwagon race, along with a number of other Western events.
This guy had been involved with one of the first rodeos in New York at the Sheep's Head Arena. That was in 1916. And at that time, he brought together two Chuckwagons, and they performed a race there, complete to lighting the stove and doing all that kind of thing. So at that time, Guy saw that as a promotional thing. It was kind of a gimmick. It wasn't part of the true contest. But he also saw how the crowd loved it and how excited they were to see these actual activities that cowboys were doing.
In 1923, when Calgary organizers were looking for exciting new events for their new annual Stampede, Wiedeck proposed a Chuckwagon race.
It was an idea that he was convinced was wonderful, but a lot of people weren't that convinced, particularly a lot of the ranchers who didn't want to use the perfectly good stock and Chuckwagons in something that sounded a little harebrained.
To test the driver's skill, each outfit was expected to make a figure-8 turn around 2 barrels. Then the wagon and crew were to race around the track, return to their start position, unhook, and set up camp. The first outfit to raise smoke won the race.
I think it was called a rangeland rumpus ruckus or something, some kind of alliterative name that really summed up what it was all about. It was a lot of fun. It was messy. The rules were raw. People made mistakes and people were crashing into each other. But the infectious excitement that really characterizes Chuckwagon races began right at that first Stampede.
The 1923 races involved 2 heats of 3 wagons each. Each outfit was organized in a similar fashion to a range roundup crew. The winning wagon had outriders from various Mosquito Creek ranches, a driver from Streeters, and a wheel team supplied by Dan Riley, and a lead team from Cross's A7 Ranch. Guy Wiedeck hadn't made many rules, but Perma's Creek rancher Clem Gardner, who had the first night's fastest run of 3 minutes and 15 seconds, was disqualified for facing his wagon in the wrong direction. That small error cost Gardner the race and eventually the show. Mosquito Creek rep Dan Riley of High River collected the first ever Chuckwagon trophy, a Stetson hat.
That 23 Stampede was one that was celebrating the pioneers of the Old West at that time. So it was very appropriate that they chose the Chuckwagon.
You couldn't find a more honest, true-to-life cowboy than Clem Gardner. Skills learned riding the open range helped Gardner win the all-around championship at the very first 1912 Stampede. And he was the winner aboard Hightower of the Saddle Bronc Championship at Calgary's 1919 Victory Stampede. Always a tough competitor in the Chuckwagon races, Clem Gardner was one of the first to drive hot-blooded thoroughbred stock. Another man who had eaten many a meal off the back of a Chuckwagon, Jack Morton, also competed in the first Chuckwagon race. Morton was as rambunctious as the event itself. His favorite pets were a pair of badgers. Morton, alias Wild Horse Jack, was one of the biggest ranchers and farmers in Alberta, and stories of Jack's wild escapades were only matched by those of his humanity and generosity. The same fella who would hook up 4 unbroken broncs to drive at the Stampede, who was known to throw his driving lines aside and slap his half-wild wheelers with a slicker, was also known to gift a drought-stricken farmer not only with a team of horses, but the harness for them as well. Morton's generosity went so far as to have his ranch cook, Horace Inkster, and the CX crew make breakfast for all and sundry in downtown Calgary during the 1923 Stampede, the first ever Stampede pancake breakfast. Early Chuckwagon competitors were required to enter at least one other rodeo event. Jack Morton entered the Wild Horse Race and occasionally competed with another legend of Chuckwagon racing, Tom Lauder.
Dad started before I was born. They used to have a Democrat team. They called it a Democrat buggy with four wheels or something. They used to drive that all over the country. They had those kind of races. And then when Guy Weedy decided to have this Calgary deal, he thought, oh boy, that's it. I'll have one of them Chuckwagons. So in he come. And he won in Calgary here 3 times.
Because he was only assessed a 1-second penalty for the infraction, Tom Lauder set a track record that stood for years when he cranked his outfit directly onto the track without bothering to make the required figure-8 turn. The judges had to keep increasing the penalty for missing a barrel until it reached 10 seconds per offense. That's when the wily Lauder decided it was worthwhile completing the figure-8 turn. Tom Lauder wasn't the only one to stretch the rules. That second year of wagon racing, so many outfits doused kerosene on the wood or straw in their stoves that the rules had to be changed. In 1925, competitors were no longer required to make a camp and a fire. The first wagon across the finish line was declared the winner. For the young man who accomplished this feat, it was his first Stampede victory, but definitely not his last. The young man's name was Cosgrave. Dick Cosgrave, and his 1925 win was to be the first of 10 Calgary Stampede championships. Cosgrave had been a pretty fair bronc rider, but it was in chuckwagon racing that he would excel. The sport became so much a part of his life that he used chuckwagons on his Christmas cards. It was largely due to Dick's attention to detail, knowing that a championship team was just that, a team, that made him so successful.
And old Dick was a top skinner, and he tended to put a top outfit together and could drive, and the same with outriders. He had top outriders all the time, you know.
Penalties could be costly, so young men who were recognized for their ability were often asked to ride behind several different outfits. Orville Strandquist entered the Stampede's winner's circle 12 times as an outrider. But in the early days of this dangerous sport, the pickings were slim.
Yeah, you could feed yourself and go to the river to drink, because nobody got paid for outriding in them days.
Orville's first year of driving a chuckwagon didn't pay much better.
And the money wasn't too good that time. I think I got a 12th. I split 12th with Crowchild, so we each got $10. And folks at home, anybody said, did you get any money? Oh, sure. They never even asked me how much it was.
Streamlined horses were the name of the game, and drivers streamlined their wagons too, even going so far as to remove the wagon's namesake, the chuck box.
Hotcakes to high stakes.
The chuckwagon races have always been colorful, but especially so after drivers and their outriders were required to wear matching colored shirts. It meant a lot of quick changes for top outriders like Lark Isbell.
Because everybody had their own different colored shirt. We'd put on about 5 shirts, and then you'd rip them off as you come in off the track, and about halfway through you'd have to jerk on some more shirts. To put all 9 shirts on was just a little bit bulky and a little bit too hot.
Since the mid-1940s, it hasn't been difficult to tell which is the Glass wagon. The family's checkerboard tradition began the year Ron and Iris Glass were married. They were traveling from Hannah to Coronation in their 3-ton truck loaded with horses and equipment. An unruly wheeler had kicked the front of the wagon out in Hannah, so Ronnie was pleased when they noticed a dead-end sign lying by the side of the road.
Ronnie said, oh, look at there, there's a nice board, just fit the end gate. So I jumped out and threw it in, and we put it in, we got to Coronation, and I said, boy, that really looks nice. Now I'm going to paint the rest like that.
The change in colors didn't hurt at all. The next year, Ron Glass won his first Calgary Stampede championship. And when he won again in 1947 and 1949, Glass qualified as only the second driver after the legendary Dick Cosgrave to win the coveted Gas Company trophy. Several years later, he won the first and only wagon race in the snow. staged for then Princess, now Queen Elizabeth. But Ron Glass claimed he was really in the business of selling horses, not chuckwagon racing, much to the chagrin of his wife, Iris.
Oh boy, Ron used to buy a team and get 4 horses working, and oh, they'd be really good. He'd just go a whole year and just win, and then somebody'd like them, so he'd sell them. Oh, I used to get really, really upset with him.
Some of Glass's toughest competition came from the partners in the Buffalo Hills outfit, Hank Willard and Lloyd Nelson.
You gotta really drive in old days. And like Hank and me, we drove 10, 12 horses in the field since we were little guys, so driving was no big deal.
The use of whips had been banned in the late 40s, so drivers had to use less forceful techniques to encourage their horses to turn and run.
Hank and Lloyd were my idols when I was a kid because they was closest to me. I knew them, and they were champions, and they knew how to handle a horse and make it do what they wanted and make it want to do what they wanted without being unkind, and that makes you a horseman.
After their outfit was cut down in 1950, a devastated Nelson quit driving for a year, and Hank Willard took over the lines. Willard patched together a new outfit, came back to Calgary, and won the 1951 show. In a sport where spectacular wrecks were common, Hank was a fearless competitor.
Old Hank was a character. He'd come out on that track, and that wheel would be off the ground for 100 feet sometimes, just balancing. But he never weakened. He was pouring on all the time.
And Hank kept on winning until he racked up a phenomenal run of 5 consecutive Calgary Stampede championships. Sadly, Willard's streak ended the way it had started, with an accident. Hank lost his great lead team, Skeeter and Vino Tinto, on the road in a trucking accident.
He never married. He just was in love with his horses. I seen when he lost his horses, he cried like some people did if they lost some part of their family.
It was appropriate that Willard's former partner, Lloyd Nelson, replace Hank on the winner's podium. Nelson would be the last man to win the Calgary Stampede, driving under his own name without support from a sponsor. Ranch names and brands had been on the canvases since racing began, but actual sponsorship started in 1941 when the Buckhorn Guest Ranch paid Marvin Flett to carry their canvas. A fine horseman, Marvin came close but never did win the Stampede. But his brother Dale made up for it by training 7 championship outfits. Dale Flett was a fierce competitor, even when riding a bronc with a wig for a movie camera.
When I was driving wagon or riding race horses when I was a small kid, I always wanted to be first.
Flett took calculated risks on the track, but left nothing to chance with his equipment, and especially with his horses. Lloyd Nelson will never forget the time he tried Dale's outfit.
I've driven some real good outfits in my day, I think, but nothing like that outfit. They just work like a machine, every one of them.
Every horse is important, but a top outfit needs agile leaders up front to make a quick figure-8 turn around the barrels and capture the inside rail position. Dallas Dorchester grew up watching his father Tom's superb lead team of Blondie and Big Shot.
They're both 21 and 20 when they were done as on the Chuckwagon, and actually Blondie was a 3-year-old when he started, so she had quite a life. Never had a blemish on her. She's just a little horse, but she could turn, and he could beat anybody out of the barrels with him.
Tom Dorchester believed that a race was won or lost in the first few seconds.
Okay, we're set here for Heat 2. Brasso Datsun on 1, Crossroads 2, Heckwell on 3, Burnmouth Sails of Thorsby on 4. The Stoves and 10 poles are all in there. Look at Tommy Dorchester getting off the 2-barrel, but he's not going to grab the rail. That goes to Ron David in the Brasso outfit.
Dorchester knew that a quick barrel turn often made the difference between being first or an also-ran. Wagon racing was Tom's life. He loved it, and so did his family. 2 sons, Gary and Dallas, and his son-in-law, Dave Lewis, went on to be champions. Tom's boys and many others got their start with Cliff Claggett's traveling rodeo show. Pete Mullaney remembers one of Claggett's caravans.
9 trucks going down the road, and the front one had a license plate on it. We traveled all down through the Maritimes, down through Toronto and Boston, down through that country, with only one license plate.
Traveling with Cliff Claggett exposed young men to the sport, but no amount of desire could replace the advantage of being born into a Chuckwagon family.
Once the kids grow up, they generally start out riding, and then they go on to driving, and you know, it's makes for a better competitor. Kids that have grown up in it.
Richard Cosgrave's grandfather was the legendary Dick Cosgrave. His father, champion driver Bobby Cosgrave.
The first race I ever drove was in Stettler. I was 14, and we went up there. It was a benefit deal, and Dad had some outriding horses hooked together, so he was hooked with Tommy Dorchester and Bob Barrett, I think it was, and we pulled in the barrels, and he said, "You want to drive?" I said, "Sure." So he jumped out, and Mom was in the grandstand. She went wild, but I was about 40 wagon lengths behind and ate a lot of dust. And
Ron Glass decided to give Richard some barreling lessons.
one of my first big outfits, I drove for Ronnie out there practicing at his place. He said, "Get up there, kid, and drive him." So Tom, he got behind the seat, and he was a little shaky. And Ronnie used to set the barrels really tough and then have a fence right there, so they had to turn. So I went up and I went by the top barrel, I don't know, about 60 feet. And on the way back, and I cranked the bottom, and Tom's going, "Don't turn him, don't turn him." And old Ronnie said, "The kid's going to make a wagon driver," because I did turn him, and we were going 9-0.
Cosgrave, Glass, Willard, and Dorchester, each racing dynasty had a founder. And in 1969, a new dynasty began, a new era began, with the arrival of Kelly Sutherland and the Record.
The days of the 1800s all across the prairie lands, to the racetracks of the modern day, from Calgary to Cheyenne. Well, the Old West has sure come alive with the running of the wagon race. Chuckwagon evolution, from hotcakes to high.
Although Kelly Sutherland represents the modern era of chuckwagon racing, he understands the old.
I mean, in those days, those old guys, they set the barrels tough because they had really good turning outfits, and you made one mistake and you ended up on your lid. I spent till I was about the age of 21, 22 being actually really scared. Partially because I was breaking an outfit, but partially because I didn't really know where I was going, and I had enough horsepower that I knew I was going to end up somewhere. It'd be nothing to see 2 to 3 wagons upset every chuckwagon meet we went to.
It's still half the pressure it used to be because the barrels are set so much softer. They're way softer. If you can't drive around these now, you got some kind of trouble, you see.
Once a fine outrider, Norm Haynes is now the Calgary Stampede's head chuckwagon judge.
When we was in the old half-mile track, the barrels were set up so it was a lot sharper turns coming to the track. And now, as you'll know, we got number 1 set off a little bit, and 2, and then 3's almost coming straight onto the track, and the other one's on the track. So this has eliminated a lot of that wagon sliding and that coming to the racetrack. It's taken a lot of the danger out of it.
The new softer barrel turn, collapsible barrels, metal poles, flak jackets for outriders, and keen-eyed judges all contribute to safer racing. But one of the greatest dangers to men, and especially to horses, was overlooked until it contributed to the worst accident in the history of chuckwagon racing. The wreck began when a lead horse stumbled after stepping into the stove rack. 3 outriders were injured in the crash, but it was the fate of 3 horses that caused the greatest uproar, and rightly so. Something had to be done. The Calgary Stampede contacted head judge Norm Haynes and gave him full rein to design an enclosed stove rack.
You go ahead and get a wagon. We'll bring it in here, and we'll put our, we've got carpenters here. We'll tear it down and put it back together, and I think it was 5 times we tore that thing down and put that back up, and finally decided that that's the way it should be. So everyone is happy about that.
Along with the new stove rack came a light rubber stove that could be loaded with one hand and collapsed if run over by a horse or a wagon. Other than the size and the weight of the stove, the outriders' tasks have changed little since the races began. It's still a 4-second penalty to leave the stove, 1 for each peg or the canvas fly left dragging. Veteran outrider Jim Nevada explains the tasks, then shows us what it's like to follow a racing chuck wagon.
The stove man goes in first and pulls the stove out, and then he backs off so the peg men can come up and get their tarp straight out. Your pegs have to be on the ground or it's a second penalty. So the idea is for both of your peg men to throw at the same time so you don't get that back and forth action. It's an even throw and straight in.
Outriders, horses, drivers, wagons. Come rain, come shine, dust or mud. Like the postman, the chuck wagons always deliver.
Hotcakes to high stakes.
Oh, for the life of an outrider. But they do love it, and so do their horses.
I think the horses like it just as well as you do. You can drive a team out in the field or anywhere and set up a set of barrels and they're just on edge. They're just as much show off as us cowboys are. They like it.
Ward Willard's great swing leaders certainly love to show off.
Here's a big raised-faced horse that was bought for $350. Bought him off Ronnie Glass. And he was a barrel hunter. But he could turn a barrel so hard, his shoulder would be about that far off the ground. But yeah, he'd turn so short, the wheel team wouldn't be able to get around there, so I had this black wheel team on there that just about had the same brains God gave a sparrow. And they'd just charge, and they'd just whip that wagon around there, and I broke every track record at every major show there was that I went into.
Ward took swing leader and his mates all the way down to Cheyenne's famous frontier days. One evening near the end of the show, Ward's crew washed the wagon too late for even the hot Wyoming sun to dry it.
I pulled out to the track and lined up. As I was pulling out there, the announcer saying to all these people down there, because of the fact I had been fortunate and had won down there the previous 2 years and broke the track record a few times, he was really giving me much too much credit, that he was screaming about how, here's the driver, here's the man, here's all this. I'm busy looking down on the floor watching this water sloshing back and forth as I'm pulling up to the barrels, thinking, oh my God. When that guy let that, down there they use a gun instead of a claxton. He let that cannon go off, them horses fired as hard as they could, and that water being down there so slick, I went through my bounce off, slid me right underneath the seat, and I went down into the box. And I let the lines slide because I didn't want to pull them off into my competitors, hoping they'd go straight on, but I was at the mercy of whatever them horses did. I slipping and sliding around that water and got up back up in the box, and I was by now I was on the first turn. I was ahead of everybody, but I wasn't sure what had happened because I was back at the stove rack most of the time. They'd taken off so hard. Anyway, we went around the track. I watched my competitors. They went by. They're all smiling. We all nodded to each other and still don't know what's happening. as I'm going past the grandstand, that announcer says, "As I told you, ladies and gentlemen, this is the man that can drive. He's the one that's done it every year." I never even saw the race. Them horses did it all.
The modern Chuckwagon horse is a top-flight racing thoroughbred.
The reason that you like to see them run at the racetrack is you know if they have ability to run, but that has no bearing on whether they would work on the Chuckwagon or not.
Oh, I pay from $1,000 to $3,500. It just depends on the type of horse, and sometimes it's $1,000 horse is a good one.
It doesn't have to be an expensive horse to be a good horse.
You could hook Cigar on a wagon, he may not be worth a hoot, and you know, you could go buy $1,000 horse that can't run at the racetrack, and he might be your star.
George Norman never believed in pushing a young horse too hard.
A 3-year-old's nice. You know, you get a young horse, he's sound, generally sound. You get an early start, but you can't run him very hard. You might go 2 or 3 trips as a 3-year-old. Then when they turn 4, they get a little better, and then they know what they have to do time they're 5 years old, and then you've got them for 4 or 5 years, and they'll work at their best from 5 on.
George pushed himself and his young outriders a little harder. Practice makes, well, winter practice makes for awfully cold feet. When it comes to hands, though, and handling a horse, Kelly Sutherland learned to use a soft touch.
Strength's important for control, but you have to have the ability to have really soft fingers or soft hands, and those horses tend to relax because the only communication you have with them is down the lines, and that's just like telegraph phone lines to them.
Alan and Buddy Bensmiller, Edgar Baptiste, and Herman Flad all began their careers driving on the Northern Chuckwagon Association circuit, and they all jumped at the opportunity to make their first trip to Calgary in 1979 to replace the striking professional drivers who had put on their own meet 30 miles to the south.
We decided we'd come out to High River and run and go head and head with Calgary. It was, you know, a lot of people thought it was a real stupid idea, and you know, maybe it was, but you know, ever since, you know, Calgary done some things different, we done some things different, and you know, now wagon racing is, you know, right at the top of its class.
George Norman had left the Northern Association the year before to join the professional ranks. His best friend, Buddy Bensmiller, had planned to join him, but instead took the opportunity to race at Calgary and win his first Stampede championship.
Everybody wanted to come to Calgary. Everybody that ever dreamed to run the wagon, they still do when we hit the big one, Calgary.
The Northern Association had been running for years and developed their own Bensmiller racing dynasty. The new boys on the block quickly fit into Calgary's Western spirit, not just on the track, but downtown at the pancake breakfasts. And the Northern boys brought with them Mae Gorst, the first and only woman to ever outride at the big show. Within 3 years, the rival groups were running together in Calgary, and 10 years after the rift, Buddy Bensmiller dueled it out with aggregate champion George Norman, along with Dallas Dorchester and Richard Cosgrave in a heart-pumping $50,000 dash for cash. It was a classic race. All 4 wagons finished less than a second apart, with Buddy beating his best friend George by a mere 6/100ths of a second.
Well, I guess it couldn't have turned out much better. I guess he ended up with the truck and I ended up with the 50. He probably wished it would have been the other way around, but still he was happy for me, and you know, and that's what kept us close, I guess.
6 years later, Buddy was on the flip side of the coin, losing the $50,000 prize to Ward Willard by a horse's nose, 3/100ths of a second. Tight finishes and a tight-knit community. There are few groups closer than the Chuckwagon racing fraternity. Few sports where the family works so hard and so closely together.
You know, not only my outfit, but I think just about every outfit, your family is. If you don't have that family atmosphere in wagon racing, you know, you ain't gonna be around very long. It's one of the, you know, the sports that really requires your whole family. Like, you know, and right from your grandsons on, like, you know, they love to come and they all help.
Yeah, the whole family works. They get in and clean the barn and lead horses and brush horses and feed, and all the wives, they get in there too. It is definitely a wonderful family thing.
The wife and the 4 kids, they all travel with me. Well, they did up till this year, and the 2 oldest now are kind of going their own ways, but they come when they can, and I always feel better when the family's with me because I don't have to worry about them at home. You know, I can concentrate more on my horses if they're with me.
I enjoy lots of people around. This is a family sport. There's lots of work back at the barns that I rely on Cindy and my family to look after. Probably if you hired it out, you probably couldn't have paid someone enough money to do it.
Everybody gets along pretty well. You have to, You go from May till October there, everybody's at the same shows and everything.
To do all the work that there is involved, you got to love the horses. And then to win, you got to be competitive. And you have to have that combination to stay on top.
Hotcakes to high stakes.
It's a good life. I like the horses, and you know, you have a bad run, you mope around and walk by the next guy that beat you the night before and his chest's out and he's strutting, and then you beat him the next night and he's down and you're up, and it's an up and down game.
This is a community that celebrates its heroes and sometimes must mourn them. A world full of traditions, where the past is almost as important as the future, and both are tied inextricably together.
Gets a guy pumped when you know your grandfather did so well, and your dad and your uncle, and just makes me proud of them, I guess, and just hope I can just fill their shoes someday.
Well, here we are again today, risking our lives for very little pay, but it's a life we'll choose and it's a life we'll live, and Lord, we don't ask anyone to give. But we want to thank you, Lord, for the many trouble-free miles that we travel each year, up and down the highways and the dusty old roads, knowing that you're near. Now, we ain't always been straight or took a religious stand, but when we crawl up on the seat of that wagon and look back at the family, there's someone we truly believe in, and you're the man. And we turn them barrels and she lifts up on 2. I sometimes hear a little voice saying, "Don't worry, son, I'm in here too." In the past, you've taken a few drivers, a few outriders, even the odd child or 2. But really, Lord, no one has ever blamed you. So we don't ask that you take us to heaven or never run in stormy weather. But when it's all over and you gather us into your mighty kingdom come, would you please keep us all together?